The winter of 1887 did not forgive the weak, and it did not forgive the abandoned. In the mud and smoke of Blackwood Gulch, a woman stood at the center of a jeering crowd, while the last person on earth who was supposed to protect her sold her like livestock to settle a gambling debt. She had nothing, no coat, no kin, no future. Then a stranger walked through that saloon door, and everything changed. Not with a sword, not with a speech, but with a quiet, devastating act of grace that neither of them would ever fully recover from. This is the story of Elara Voss and the mountain that became her soul. Stay with us until the very end. And before we begin, drop a comment below and tell us what city you are watching from. We love knowing you are out there. The town of Blackwood Gulch had not been built so much as it had been hammered into the earth by desperate men who arrived with picks and ambition and left with neither. It sat in a narrow valley between two granite ridges that seemed to lean toward each other overhead, as though the mountains themselves were ashamed of what had taken root below. The main street, if one were generous enough to call it that, was a single corridor of plank-board storefronts and canvas-sided tents, pressed together like teeth in a crowded jaw. There was a general goods store, a rough-cut lumber office, a blacksmith who doubled as a surgeon, and at the far end, occupying the widest and most permanent building in town, the Miners' Rest Saloon. The Miners' Rest was the financial, social, and moral center of Blackwood Gulch, which is to say, it was where men went to lose what little they had left. In the warmer months, it smelled of sawdust and spilled ale and wood smoke. In November, when the first true cold descended from the high peaks, it smelled of wet wool and desperation. The long bar was scarred with the initials of 100 men who had wanted to leave some mark on the world before the mountains swallowed them. The gambling tables in the back room were green felt gone gray from years of sliding coins and sliding fortunes. The iron stove in the corner burned all day and never quite warmed the room. On the evening of November the 4th, with the sky outside, turning a bruised and unnatural yellow, the kind of yellow that every man in Blackwood Gulch recognized as the sky's warning, every table in the Miners' Rest was occupied. Not with the usual loose cheer of payday drinking. Tonight the atmosphere was different, tighter, the kind of collective attention that gathers when something is about to happen that no one will speak of afterward, but everyone will remember. At the largest table in the back room, a man named Corbin Voss sat across from a man named Silas Greer. Corbin was 32 years old and had the sunken, restless look of someone who had been fleeing consequences his entire life, and was only now running out of road. His coat was expensive once, now it was the ghost of an expensive coat, the cuffs frayed, the buttons mismatched where originals had been lost and replaced. His eyes were quick and clever, in the way that a cornered animal's eyes are quick, scanning the room for exits, even when he was pretending to be calm. Silas Greer was not quick. Silas Greer was the kind of man who did not need to be quick, because nothing had ever required it of him. He was broad and pale, with a stillness about him that was not peace, but the absence of anything resembling conscience. He ran the two largest mining claims on the South Ridge, which he had not earned, but had acquired through a series of transactions that the men of Blackwood Gulch understood perfectly and discussed only in careful language. He wore a clean shirt. He had clean hands. These two facts alone set him apart in the Gulch, and he knew it. Between the two men on the table was a piece of paper. A debt note. Corbin's signature at the bottom, Silas's at the top, and a number in the middle that had not shrunk in 4 months of effort. It had, in fact, grown. "I've been patient, Corbin." Silas's voice was quiet, the way a deep river is quiet. It moved without hurry because it did not need to hurry. "I think most men in this room would agree I have been uncommonly patient with you." There were perhaps 20 men in that back room. Not one of them made a sound. Corbin's hands were flat on the table. "I need 2 more weeks. I have a prospect on the north face. The vein is close. I can feel it. 2 weeks and I'll have double what I owe you." "You told me that in September," Silas said. He did not raise his voice. He picked up the debt note and looked at the number as though reading it for the first time, though both men knew he could recite it in his sleep. "And in October. This time is different. It never is." Silas set the note back down. He folded his clean hands on the table. "Here is what I am prepared to offer you, Corbin. I will forgive the entirety of this debt, every penny tonight, in exchange for one thing." Corbin's eyes steadied for the first time that evening. The calculation behind them was almost visible. "Name it." Silas did not answer immediately. He looked past Corbin toward the doorway that led from the back room into the main saloon, where the bar ran its length and the stove pushed out its insufficient heat. His gaze moved with the deliberateness of a man who had already decided everything and was only now performing the theater of decision. "Bring her in," he said to the man standing at the door. The man at the door had no name that anyone used. He was simply Greer's man, one of several who functioned as extensions of Silas's will. He stepped out into the main saloon and came back leading a woman by the elbow. Her name was Elara Voss. She was 26 years old, and she had been working since she was 9. This was not a metaphor or an exaggeration. At 9 years old, after her mother died of a fever, that proper medical care might have prevented Elara had taken over the cooking, cleaning, hauling, and mending for her father and her half-brother Corbin. Her father had been a hard but not unkind man, quietly proud of her capable hands and her refusal to complain. He had died when she was 17, leaving her the cabin they rented, the tools they used, and the debt they owed for both. Corbin had inherited nothing but his habits, and those were expensive. For 9 years since her father's death, Elara had kept them alive. She took in washing from the mining camp. She preserved food in the summer for sale in the winter. She repaired saddles and harnesses with a skill that most cobblers would have envied, her fingers moving over leather with a patience and precision that transformed raw hide into something lasting. She had worked in the cold before the sun was up, and worked by firelight long after it set. Her hands were the hands of a woman twice her age, broad and calloused and completely honest. Her body reflected the life she had lived. She was powerfully built, with the wide shoulders and solid frame of someone who had carried genuine weight for years, not in a gymnasium as sport, but on real hillsides in real weather, because the alternative was starving. She was not soft. There was nothing decorative about her. She moved through space with the particular economy of a person who has never had the luxury of waste, every motion purposeful, every gesture aimed at something that needed doing. She was not, in the language of Blackwood Gulch, what men called pretty. The men of Blackwood Gulch had a very specific and very narrow idea of what pretty meant, and it had more to do with fragility than with anything worth admiring. Elara was the opposite of fragile. She had kept 2 people alive on almost nothing for 9 years, and it showed not as a flaw, but as a kind of testimony written in flesh and bone. Tonight she wore her work dress, a dark gray wool that had been washed so many times it had gone thin at the elbows and faded to the color of ash at the hem. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, more from habit than from care. There was a smear of ash on her left forearm from the stove she had been tending when Greer's man had come to the cabin and told her she was needed at the saloon. She had not believed walking in that what was needed was herself. She understood now. She stood in the lamplight of the back room while the men around the table looked at her the way men at auction look at livestock, appraising and indifferent and already calculating use. The murmuring from the main bar had gone quiet. Men drifted to the doorway to watch. Someone laughed, a short private sound quickly swallowed. Elara did not look at the men watching. She looked at Corbin. He would not meet her eyes. Her right hand was in the pocket of her apron. The apron was a working apron, flour-dusty and oil-stained, and inside its deep front pocket beneath her clenched fist was a shard of broken glass. She had picked it up 2 weeks ago when a jar had broken while she was canning the last of the autumn berries. She had kept it in her pocket ever since, not because she had planned anything, but because some instinct in her, older and more honest than hope, had told her to hold on to it. She held on to it now. "There she is." Silas Greer looked at her the way he had looked at the debt note, dispassionately, evaluating a number. "A strong worker by all accounts. Your brother speaks highly of her usefulness." Corbin's jaw moved, still not looking at her. "This is the arrangement," Silas said, addressing the room now as much as either individual within it. "The debt is settled. Miss Voss comes to work at my camp, cooking, washing, whatever the camp needs. For wages—" Elara's voice was level. She did not trust herself to make it warm. Something shifted in the room. Several men found reasons to study their boots. Silas smiled. It did not reach anything behind his eyes. "For room and board, which is more than generous given your brother's situation." "My brother's situation," Elara repeated. Now Corbin looked at her. What she saw in his face was worse than cruelty. It was relief. He was relieved. The transaction was nearly complete, and the weight of it, the debt, the guilt, the accumulated years of her keeping him from drowning was lifting from him with every second that was passed. He was going to let this happen because it made his life easier. That was the whole of it. Elara felt something shift in her chest. Not breaking. She had trained herself against breaking a long time ago. What shifted was something colder and clearer, a realignment the way a frozen river shifts before it cracks open. She understood in the space of 3 seconds of looking at her brother's face that there was nothing left to save between them. Whatever obligation she had carried for 9 years had just been traded away by the person she had carried it for. The shard of glass in her pocket was a 1/4 inch thick at its widest point and approximately 3 inches long. She had tested the edge twice since finding it. It was very sharp. She was thinking about this clearly and without drama when the front door of the saloon opened. The sound was noticeable because it was cold outside, and the door let in a blade of November air that every person in the room felt simultaneously. Several men shifted. One of the card players near the bar glanced up. The man who entered was very large. This is not a figure of speech. He was the kind of large that makes a door frame look like a reasonable constraint, that makes other men in a room unconsciously take a half step back without being aware they have done it. He wore a coat made of bearskin that had clearly been made by himself rather than purchased, the seams thick and uneven, the whole thing dense and dark and smelling of wood smoke and pine resin. Beneath the coat he was dressed for hard work in cold weather, heavy canvas trousers and boots that had been resoled at least once. His beard was full and dark and shot through with early gray. His face was the face of a man who spent most of his time above the tree line, weathered and direct with no particular interest in what others thought of its appearance. He stood in the doorway for a moment and let his eyes adjust from the dark outside to the lamplight within. He was carrying a list in one hand, the list of supplies he had come to acquire before the storm hit. He looked at the list. He looked at the room. He saw Elara. He looked at her the way a person looks at something that does not match the place it has been put. Not pity. More like the quiet, alert attention of someone who has walked into a room and noticed that the stove has been left open. Something needs attending to. Something is wrong here. His name was Abraham Calloway, though no one in Blackwood Gulch had ever called him Abraham. He was Bram, simply Bram, and he had lived for 11 years on a piece of land 2,000 feet above the valley floor on the south face of Riven Peak. He came down to the gulch 4 times a year for supplies, and otherwise did not require the company of other people. He was not a sociable man. He was not unfriendly, but he conserved himself the way he conserved his firewood carefully and with full knowledge of how long the winter would be. He had come tonight for flour and salt pork and lamp oil. He had not come for whatever was happening in this back room. He looked at Silas Greer. He looked at Corbin. He looked at the men watching from the doorway. He looked at Elara again, standing in her ash-smudged apron, in the lamplight, her hand buried in her pocket, her jaw set in a way that he recognized without being able to name it. He had seen that particular set of jaw on men in very bad situations who had decided that they were not going to show how bad it was. He crossed the room. He did not move quickly. There was no performance in it. He simply walked through the crowd of watchers as though they were not there, in any meaningful sense, moved to the large table in the back, and stood at its edge. He was tall enough that the lamp above the table did not clear the top of his head. "What is the number?" he said. Silas Greer looked up at him with the expression of a man who has never been interrupted by a weather event. "I beg your pardon." "The debt." Bram nodded toward the paper on the table. "What is the number?" It was not a question the way he said it. It was a request for data. Silas's eyes moved to Bram's face, calculating something. "This is a private matter, Calloway." "I can see that." Bram waited. Silas named a number. He named it the way men name numbers they expect to be prohibitive, with a slight upward inflection at the end, a challenge dressed as information. Bram reached inside his bearskin coat. He produced a leather pouch that was heavy, in the way that only one thing is heavy, and he set it on the table with a sound that every man in that room understood immediately. "There is more than enough there," Bram said. He looked at Silas. "I want the debt note." A very specific silence took hold of the room. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a large number of people holding a large number of breaths simultaneously. Silas Greer did not move for several seconds. His expression was the expression of a man accustomed to being the only person in any room who held the cards, discovering that someone else had brought their own deck. His eyes moved from the pouch to Bram's face and back again. The calculation there was visible. Refusing would cost him nothing financially, but it would cost him something in the room, something in the way the other men were watching. He was a man who understood the currency of perception. He picked up the debt note. He looked at it. He slid it across the table. Bram picked it up. He looked at it for a moment, long enough to confirm the number. Then, with no theatrical embellishment whatsoever, he tore it in half. Then in half again. Then he dropped the pieces into the spittoon at the foot of the bar. The silence stretched another 3 seconds. Then Bram turned away from Silas entirely, as though the man had ceased to be relevant, and he looked at Elara. She was watching him. Her hand was still in her pocket. He spoke to her directly, without preamble, without the softening deflection that people use when they are uncertain of someone's dignity. He spoke to her as though she were the only relevant person in the room, which at that moment was, as far as he was concerned, the truth. "The debt is gone," he said. "You are a free woman. I want to be clear about that before I say anything else." She said nothing. Her eyes were steady on his face, looking for the catch, the pivot, the moment when this would reveal itself as something other than what it appeared to be. She had been in enough situations in her life to know that the moment of apparent rescue was frequently also the moment of new and worse captivity. He seemed to understand that she was looking for the catch. He did not rush past it. "There is a blizzard coming," he said. "It will hit within the hour, a serious one. You have no coat that I can see, and wherever you were planning to go tonight, it will not be reachable before the weather closes in." He paused. "I have a cabin on Riven Peak. It is well built and warm and stocked for winter. I need someone to manage the household for the season. Cooking, cleaning, whatever the cabin needs. Room board and fair wages paid in coin, not in promises." Another pause. "You can walk out that door right now if you want to. The debt is gone regardless. No one in this room has any claim on you. But in 1 hour, you will need to be somewhere with a roof, and I am offering you one." He stopped. He did not embellish. He did not reach for her. He stood where he was and waited. Outside, the wind had picked up. Even through the thick walls of the saloon, they could all hear it, the high, thin sound of the peaks beginning to talk to each other in their winter language. Elara's hand came out of her pocket. Empty. She looked at her brother one last time. Corbin had a look on his face that was trying to be remorse, and failing, settling instead into something that resembled indignation, as though he were the one who had been wronged here. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, long enough to see him for exactly what he was and to stop carrying any hope that he was something else. Then she looked at the large man in the bearskin coat who had walked into a saloon he had not meant to walk into, and dismantled a transaction he had not been party to, and asked nothing in return except the opportunity to offer her a choice. "I will need my things from the cabin," she said. "We can stop on the way," he said. She walked past the men in the doorway. They parted for her not with courtesy, but with the particular unease of people who have witnessed something that has shifted the arithmetic of the room and are not yet sure how to recalculate. She walked through the main bar, past the long, scarred counter, and the men with their cups past the iron stove that had never quite warmed the room, and out through the front door into the cold. The sky outside was the yellow of old bone. The wind came off the peaks in long, organized gusts that meant business. She could smell the snow in it, not the clean smell of an ordinary snowfall, but the heavy mineral smell of a serious storm building itself up with intention. Bram's wagon was tied at the post outside. It was a working wagon, nothing decorative about it, solid and loaded with the winter supplies he had come to town to collect. The horse, a big dark roan with a sensible disposition, shifted her weight as Elara approached. Elara put her hand on the horse's neck briefly, not a greeting exactly, more an acknowledgement. The horse held still. She stood at the wagon and did not climb in. Not yet. When Bram came out of the saloon a minute later, having apparently concluded whatever he needed to conclude inside, he found her standing at the wagon with her hands at her sides, looking at the darkening sky. He untied the horse without speaking. He did not interpret her hesitation as indecision. He seemed to understand that she was thinking, and that thinking was a reasonable thing to be doing. "You have my word," he said, not looking at her, checking the horse's bridle with the focused attention of a man who trusts buckles more than speeches. "That this is exactly what I said it was. A job, your own room, wages paid monthly. I am not a complicated man, Miss Voss. I mean what I say." Elara looked at his hands on the bridle. They were the hands of someone who worked. Not the performed work of a man who wanted to appear capable, but the actual work of a person who had been doing difficult things for a long time and had the hands to prove it. The knuckles were scarred. The palms were rough. There was pine resin in the creases of his right thumb. She had spent 9 years reading people through their hands. It was the most honest part of most people. You could lie with your face. You could lie with your voice. Your hands told the truth of how you actually spent your days. She climbed into the wagon. Bram climbed up on the other side and took the reins. He clicked to the horse, and she started forward without drama, and they drove down the single road of Blackwood Gulch past the general goods store, and the blacksmith past the canvas tents going dark in the early evening, toward the north end of town, where the cabin Elara had shared with her brother stood at the edge of the inhabited world. They stopped there. Elara went inside. She packed her things with the efficiency of someone who had never owned much and had learned not to mourn that fact. A wool blanket, a change of clothes, her father's folding knife, a small tin box containing the sum of her savings, which was not large, but was entirely her own, every penny earned in transactions her brother had not known about. A book of pressed mountain flowers that she had assembled over 3 summers as a private project that served no practical purpose, which she had never shown anyone, which she almost left behind, and then did not. She came back out with a bundle under one arm. She did not look at the cabin. She climbed into the wagon. The snow began before they had gone a quarter-mile up the switchback road toward Riven Peak. Not the tentative first flakes of a polite snowfall. Big, fast, decisive flakes that said the sky had made up its mind. The roan pushed into it without complaint. Elara sat on the wagon bench with her bundle in her lap and watched the valley disappear below them as the road climbed and the snow thickened, and the lights of Blackwood Gulch went first to orange smears and then to nothing. She thought about the glass shard which she had left in her apron pocket, which was now, she realized, folded inside the bundle on her lap. She thought about Corbin's face, the relief on it when the transaction was nearly done. She thought about the next thing that was going to happen to her, and the thing after that. And the thing after that, the way she always thought in sequences, in contingencies, in practical steps, because that was the only kind of thinking that had ever actually helped her. She did not know this man. She did not know this mountain. She did not know if the warmth he had shown in the saloon was genuine or strategic. She had seen both, and she knew they could look identical from the outside. But she was alive. She was on a road going somewhere, instead of standing in a lamplight room being discussed by men as a solution to their own problems. She had a bundle with her father's knife in it and a tin box of her own money and a book of pressed flowers that no one knew existed. For now, that was enough to work with. The wind came across the face of Riven Peak, and the snow came with it, and the wagon climbed, and the valley was gone, and the night closed around them like something being settled. The road up Riven Peak was not a road in any civic sense of the word. It was an intention, a line of least resistance that Bram had cut into the mountainside over 11 years of use, wide enough for the wagon in most places, and narrower than comfortable in others, where the granite pushed in from both sides and the wheels came within a hand's width of the edge. In summer it was passable and demanding. In the first hour of a serious November blizzard, it was something else entirely. Elara braced her feet against the footboard and held her bundle against her chest and watched Bram handle the reins. He did not fight the horse. That was the first thing she noticed. Most men fought their animals in bad weather, hauling back when the horse slowed pushing when she balked, making the animal's fear worse by layering their own anxiety on top of it. Bram let the roan set her own pace on the steep sections and spoke to her occasionally in a low, even voice. Not commands, exactly, more like information being shared between two parties who were both trying to solve the same problem. The roan's ears moved toward his voice each time he spoke. She trusted him. That meant something. The snow came sideways now, driven by a wind that had found its full purpose. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since they left the valley floor, and it was still dropping. Elara could feel it in her face and in the thin wool of her dress sleeves, the cold pressing through the fabric with the patient insistence of something that had all the time in the world. She did not have a coat. She had a wool blanket in her bundle, and she thought about pulling it out, and then did not, because unpacking anything on a moving wagon in a blizzard was impractical, and because she was not prepared to show discomfort in front of this man yet. She was aware of how irrational that was. She was also aware that it was true. Bram glanced at her once briefly, the way a person glances at a gauge to check a reading. He did not comment on the fact that she was visibly cold. He reached behind the wagon bench without looking and pulled forward a heavy canvas blanket of the sort used to cover freight, thick and slightly stiff with age, smelling of hay and horse and long use. He set it on the bench between them. He did not hand it to her. He did not suggest she use it. He simply made it available and returned his attention to the road. Elara picked it up after a moment and put it around her shoulders. It was not a graceful thing. It was a freight blanket. But it was warm in the way that only genuinely thick, dense things are warm, the warmth of substance rather than refinement, and she was grateful for it in a way that she kept entirely off her face. They did not speak for a long time. The wind and the snow and the sound of the wheels on frozen ground made conversation impractical in any case. Elara used the silence to observe. She watched the way the road curved into the mountain, and how Bram anticipated each curve before it was visible, which meant he had driven this road in conditions like this before, and had memorized its character. She watched how he scanned the tree line on the uphill side, checking for the weight of snow on branches, watching for the particular lean of a loaded pine that meant something was about to come down. She watched his hands on the reins, steady and economical, no wasted motion. She catalogued these things the way she catalogued everything, not sentimentally, but practically building a picture of who she was dealing with. A man who knew his mountain. A man who did not perform his competence, but simply exercised it. A man who had made available a freight blanket without turning it into a gesture, requiring acknowledgement or gratitude. That last thing stayed with her. The cabin appeared out of the snow, and dark, gradually the way things appear in a blizzard first, as a change in the texture of the darkness ahead, then as a shape, then as a structure with a roof and walls, and the orange suggestion of firelight in one window. It was larger than she had expected, not large in a prosperous way, but large in a deliberate way, the way a structure is large when it has been added onto over time by someone who understood what a mountain winter required and kept adding what was needed. There was a main cabin of squared logs, a covered porch running across the front, and attached at the right side, a combination woodshed and shelter for the animals that ran back into the hillside, and was banked with earth on 3 sides. The whole thing sat in a natural hollow that cut most of the wind, and the large spruce trees above it held a roof of white that would fall somewhere else. Bram pulled the wagon under the shelter and stopped. The sudden absence of wind was physical, like a door closing. The roan exhaled loudly, a long, relieved sound. "Go inside," Bram said. He was already climbing down, moving toward the horse's head. Bar on the left side of the door lifts from outside. Stove is banked. It will come up fast. Wood is in the box on the right of the hearth. Elara climbed down. Her legs were stiff from the cold and the tension of the ride, and she did not allow herself to stumble. She carried her bundle across the small open distance between the shelter and the covered porch, pushed through the front door, and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was dark, except for the faint red glow from the cracks in the iron stove on the far wall, and for the first 30 seconds she simply stood and let her eyes adjust. What emerged from the dark was a single large room that was extraordinarily clean. Not decorated, not comfortable in any deliberate way, but clean with the thoroughness of someone who had decided that order was a form of self-respect. The plank floor was swept. The long table in the center was bare and square and level. The 2 chairs beside the stove were placed with a precision that suggested they were always returned to exactly those positions. The shelves along the east wall held provisions organized by type and by size, the labels facing outward, the containers spaced evenly. Everything in the room was functional. There was nothing in it that was only beautiful. And yet there was, Elara noticed, a small shelf above the table that held 3 things that served no practical purpose. A fragment of quartz that had been polished by water to a near transparency. A small carving of a bird, a hawk, or an eagle, executed in dark wood with careful, patient detail. And a tin cup holding 3 dried wildflowers faded to the color of old paper. She looked at the cup of dried flowers for a long moment. Then she crossed to the stove and opened the draft and added 2 pieces of wood from the box beside the hearth and had the fire climbing within 3 minutes. Bram came in from the shelter 20 minutes later, his coat and beard silvered with snow. He stamped his boots at the door and hung the coat on the peg beside it, and the cabin expanded slightly with the outdoor smell of him, cold air and pine resin and the faint salt of hard work. He looked at the stove and at the way the firelight was moving. He looked at Elara, who was standing at the far end of the room, inspecting the shelves of provisions with the expression of someone conducting an inventory. "There is a room at the back," he said. He moved to the stove and held his hands toward it. "Through that door. It is small, but it has a proper bed. It is yours." Elara turned. "Where do you sleep?" "Loft." He nodded upward. There was indeed a loft accessible by a short ladder against the north wall from which the edge of a bedroll was visible. "I have slept up there for 11 years. I sleep well up there." She looked at the ladder. She looked at the door he had indicated. She said, "All right." She went through the door and found a room that was barely larger than the bed it contained, but the bed was solidly built and had a thick quilt on it, and a second folded at the foot, and there was a small window with a wooden shutter that fit properly against the frame and cut the draught entirely. A single peg on the wall beside the door, a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, empty. She set her bundle on the chest. She sat on the edge of the bed. The frame did not creak. She put both hands flat on the quilt and sat there in the small room listening to the storm work itself up outside and feeling the warmth from the stove beginning to reach through the wall. She was alive and she was warm, and she was, as far as she could determine, in no immediate danger. She sat with that for a moment, which was longer than she usually allowed herself for such things. In the main room she heard Bram moving around the quiet domestic sounds of a man putting a kitchen in order for the evening, the clank of a pot, the sound of water from a barrel, the particular rhythm of someone who had been doing this alone for so long that the movements had become a kind of music he made without thinking. She heard him sit down. She heard the creak of the chair nearest the stove. Then she heard nothing but the storm. She unpacked her bundle with care. The wool blanket she folded and placed in the chest. The change of clothes on the peg. The tin box of money she placed at the bottom of the chest beneath the blanket. The folding knife she put in the right pocket of her dress, where it would be when she needed it. The book of pressed flowers she held for a moment. It was a thing she had never shown another person. 3 summers of patient collection flowers pressed between sheets of brown paper and then carefully mounted, each one labeled in her own handwriting, not with their common names, but with the place where she had found them and the date. June the 7th, the meadow above the North Creek first light. August the 2nd, the high ridge just below where the weather turns. October the 10th, a single late bloom at the edge of the tree line, no color left in it, only the shape. She put it at the bottom of the chest under everything else and closed the lid. She went back into the main room. Bram was sitting in the chair nearest the stove with a cup of something hot looking at the fire, with the focused vacancy of a tired man doing nothing intentionally. He glanced up when she came in. He did not look relieved that she had reappeared, or nervous, or anything with a performance to it. He looked at her the way he had looked at the road, taking in information without commentary. "There is coffee," he said. "Pot is on the stove, cups on the second shelf." Elara got a cup of coffee. She sat in the other chair, the one on the far side of the stove, and drank it and looked at the fire. The coffee was strong and not particularly good, and was exactly what she needed. "What are the hours?" she said. Bram looked at her. "I beg your pardon." "The work. What are the hours? When do you expect breakfast? When is the main meal? Is there a specific order to the household tasks you have been doing yourself that I need to learn, or do you have no preference for method, so long as the result is the same?" He was quiet for a moment. "I have been getting my own breakfast at first light, usually just porridge or bread. Main meal around midday if the weather allows me to come in. otherwise in the evening. I have no strong preference for method." "What are the wages?" He named a figure. It was fair. It was more than fair. It was, in fact, the most money anyone had ever offered to pay her for work, and she had done much harder work than keeping a cabin. "Paid monthly," he added, "in coin." She nodded. "All right." She drank her coffee. "I will need to learn where everything is. Tomorrow, if the storm allows, I would like to go through the stores and understand what needs doing before the deep winter sets in." "The storm will not allow tomorrow," Bram said. "This one runs 3 to 4 days by the look of it." She considered this. "Then I will start with the interior." "There is no urgency," he said. "You have just arrived in the middle of a blizzard after an evening that I imagine was not pleasant. You are allowed to simply be here for a night." Elara looked at him. The firelight was doing things to the angles of his face that made him look older and also more settled. A face that had arrived at itself and was not still arguing with the result. "I am more comfortable when I know what is expected," she said. "I understand that," he said. He said it simply without the particular careful gentleness that people put around words they think might break something. He said it the way you say something that is true. "Then what is expected is this. The cabin stays in order. The food is managed so that we come out of winter with enough left to reach the first supply run in spring. The animals are tended on days when I cannot do it. Beyond that, I expect nothing in particular." She studied his face. He held her study without shifting. "And nothing else," she said. She said it flatly, not as a question. He met her eyes. "Nothing else," he said. "You are an employee, Miss Voss. That is the whole of it. If it is ever anything other than that, it will be because both of us have decided so freely with full wits about us. And that is a conversation for some other time, if it ever occurs at all." The fire crackled. The storm moved across the roof with its big, indifferent sound. Elara finished her coffee. She set the cup on the table. "Good night, then," she said. "Good night, Miss Voss." She went back through the door to the small room with the solid bed and the proper-fitting shutter and the chest that held the private sum of her life, and she lay down on top of the quilt without undressing, because old habits die harder than intentions, and she listened to the blizzard. It was a serious blizzard. It had a depth to it, a sense of mass and duration, the kind of storm that does not hurry because it has all the time it requires. She could feel the cabin holding against it, the thick log walls absorbing and deflecting the banked earth on 3 sides of the animal shelter, doing its quiet work. The structure was sound. Whoever had built it had understood what a mountain winter meant and had built accordingly. She thought about the chair nearest the stove, the clean floor, the cup of dried wild flowers on the shelf that served no purpose except to be there. She thought about the way he had said, "I understand that," with no softening around it, just the acknowledgement of a true thing. She had expected to lie awake for hours and was asleep within 20 minutes, and it was the deepest sleep she had managed in longer than she could accurately remember. The storm ran 4 days. In those 4 days, Elara learned the cabin the way she learned everything methodically and completely, moving through it in the long hours while Bram was in the animal shelter, or digging out the paths, or doing whatever it was he did in the woodshed that produced the regular sounds of industry. She opened every cabinet and examined every shelf. She learned the system of the stores, which was not a system exactly, but an accumulation of habit, and she improved it with small, unannounced reorganizations that she expected him to notice and say nothing about, which was what happened. She found the tools and their locations and assessed which were in good condition and which needed attention. She found the weak point in the window shutter of the main room and fixed it with a wedge of wood that she cut herself from a piece of scrap in the woodshed. On the second day she made bread. She made it the way she always made bread, which was efficiently and without ceremony, measuring by eye and feel rather than exact quantities, because she had made enough bread in her life that exact quantities were no longer necessary. The dough came together well, and she set it to rise near the stove and went to work on something else. When she came back, it was risen, and she put it in the oven box and started the timing in her head, and then forgot to adjust for the altitude, because she had spent her entire life cooking at the elevation of the valley floor, and the cabin on Riven Peak was 2,000 feet above that. And at this altitude, the air was different in ways that affected exactly this kind of chemistry, and she did not know that yet. She knew something was wrong when the cabin filled with the particular smell of bread that has given up rather than bread that is finishing. She opened the oven box and found a dense, heavy disk of dark brown that had the structural properties of a roof tile. She stood and looked at it. The feeling that moved through her was disproportionate to the failure. She knew that even as it was happening, it was not about the bread. It was not even about the wasted flour, though she was aware of the wasted flour and would account for it. It was older than that, the feeling. It was the feeling from 100 different kitchens in 100 different circumstances where a mistake had not been allowed to simply be a mistake, where a burned dinner had been the opening of something worse, where imperfection had been an offense requiring a response. She heard Bram's boots on the porch, and the sound went through her the way the memory of a loud noise goes through you even after the noise itself is done. He came through the door, and she heard his footsteps cross the cabin, and she was aware that he had stopped somewhere behind her, and that he could see what she was looking at, and that she was not moving, and that this probably looked strange, and she could not make herself move. She heard him cross to the table. She heard the sound of the bench being pulled out. She heard him sit down. Then she heard a small, deliberate crack, the sound of a piece of bread being broken from the ruined loaf. A silence. Then the sound of chewing, considered thoughtful chewing. She turned around. Bram was sitting at the table with a piece of the wrecked bread in his hand, chewing it with the expression of a man working through a complicated problem. He swallowed. He looked at the piece in his hand. He set it down on the table. "High altitude," he said. "The bread takes a different measure of everything up here. More liquid, less rise time. It took me 2 full winters to get it right." He paused. "My second year here, I tried to make a proper stew, and I miscalculated the water and let it go too long on a day when I was in the woodshed later than I planned. Came back in and had what I can only describe as leather in a pot. I ate it anyway because I was hungry, and I had made it, and it seemed like the honest thing to do." He looked at her. There was nothing in his face designed to comfort her. It was simply a face reporting events. "The bread at altitude took me a full winter season to learn," he said. "You have been here 4 days. I will write down what I know about it and put it on the shelf by the flour." Elara was quiet for a moment. The feeling had moved, not gone, but shifted, changed its shape into something smaller that she could carry without showing. "I wasted the flour," she said. "Yes," he said. "Write it in the accounts and adjust the next order accordingly. It is flour. We have enough." She looked at him for another moment. This man sitting at his table in his clean cabin, holding a piece of ruined bread, with the same equanimity he brought to everything, the road in a blizzard, the transaction in the saloon, the simple fact of her presence in his home. She took the ruined loaf off the oven board. She carried it to the door and set it on the porch railing where the winter birds would find it. She came back inside and got herself a cup of water and sat at the table across from him. "Tell me the right measurements," she said. He told her. She remembered them. The next loaf 3 days later came out exactly right, with the particular crumb and crust of servitude that has been made by someone who has understood the specific conditions of its making. She did not mention that she was pleased with it. She put it on the table and went to do something else, but she noticed that he ate 3 pieces of it. By the end of the first week, the storm had moved on and left behind it a silence, and a white, and a quality of cold that was different from the cold she had known in the valley. Valley cold was damp and gray and communal. Mountain cold was dry and absolute, and strangely private, the kind of cold that clarifies rather than suppresses, that makes the air thin and bright and extraordinarily quiet. She stood on the front porch on the morning after the storm ended and looked at what the mountain had become, and did not have any adequate language for it, so she did not try to find any. The work settled into its shape. She was good at it, and she knew she was good at it, and she did not require acknowledgement to continue being good at it. But she noticed things. The way he shoveled the path to the door every morning before she was up so she would not have to wade through to the woodpile. The way he moved the heavy water barrel closer to the stove on the coldest nights so she would not have to break ice from the top in the morning. Small adjustments made quietly in the hours when she was not present to receive them as gestures. And she noticed at the end of the second week that there was a new chair near the stove. Not a new chair exactly. The chair that had been in the corner, the one she had avoided because it was slightly uneven and made a tilting sensation she did not like, had been reinforced. The back legs were solid now, the seat steadied, the whole thing made level and dependable. She stood and looked at it for a moment. She knew why. She had avoided the chair, and he had noticed her avoiding it, and he had fixed it. Without comment, without the announcement that would have turned a small, useful act into a transaction requiring her gratitude, she sat in the chair. It held her completely solidly, without the slightest give or tilt. She sat there by the fire for a while, with her hands in her lap, listening to the mountain. She did not call it anything. She did not let herself form it into a feeling she would have to carry, but something in her, something that had been braced and watchful and running all its calculations on the assumption that the catch was coming, the pivot, the moment when the arithmetic of this arrangement would reveal its true terms, something in that part of her grew just slightly quieter. She was still waiting for the catch. She was not sure she knew how to stop waiting for it. But the chair held and the bread rose and the mountain was extraordinary, and for now that was enough to go on. The days shortened and the cold deepened, and the mountain became by degrees a different world than the one below. Elara had known winter before the valley kind, the kind that was gray and wet and pressed down on everything like a damp hand. This was not that. This was winter as a presence, as a thing with dimension and personality that came at you straight and clean and expected you to meet it on its own terms. She found to her own surprise that she respected it. The routine established itself with the natural authority of things that make sense. She was up before light, the stove rebuilt from its banked coals, water heated, the first round of the day's work begun before the sky outside the east-facing window showed any color at all. Bram came down from the loft in the hour before sunrise, ate whatever was on the table, pulled on his coat and his boots, and went out to the animals, and then to whatever the day required of him on the mountain, which in winter was primarily the work of keeping things intact against the weight and cold and isolation that winter brought as its standard conditions. He came in at midday when he came in at all, ate quickly and returned to the cold. In the evenings he came in with the dark, and they ate the main meal at the table, and afterward there was the fire and the quiet. The quiet between them was not uncomfortable. That was the thing Elara noticed first, and kept noticing the way a person keeps touching a place that had been sore and finding that it is no longer sore. She had spent her life in environments where silence was a weather system, where the absence of speech between people meant something was being calculated, or withheld, or prepared. She had learned to read silence the way some people learn to read clouds for what it was about to become. In this cabin in the evenings by the stove, the silence did not mean anything except that two tired people were sitting near warmth, and neither of them needed to fill the air with noise in order to prove that the other was still present. Some evenings they talked. Not at length, not with any dramatic architecture of revelation, but in the way of people who are gradually constructing a shared knowledge of each other from small pieces set down one at a time. She learned that he had come to Riven Peak at 27 after a decade of following other men's work in other men's territory and deciding that he was done with that particular arrangement. He had come with enough saved to buy the land and build the first section of the cabin and get through one winter. And one winter had become 11 because the mountain had suited him in a way that nothing in the lower world had quite managed. He had no family he was in contact with. He had no pending obligations anywhere. He was in the most complete sense his own. She told him less than he told her, which he appeared to understand and not resent. She told him about the leather repair work which he asked about after noticing the calluses specific to that trade on the inner edges of her fingers. She told him about the canning and the washing and the way she had organized the money she earned from both quietly in the tin box against the day when she would need it to go somewhere. She did not tell him where she had planned to go, partly because she had not decided, and partly because the plan had been interrupted by a blizzard and a bearskin coat and a torn debt note in a spittoon. "You were saving to leave," he said. It was not an accusation. It was the observation of a man who had arranged facts into their most logical pattern. "Yes," she said. "Before your brother arranged the other thing." "Yes?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Where were you planning to go?" She considered the question. "Somewhere I had not already been," she said. He looked at her then with something in his face that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, a slight shift in the set of his mouth that indicated a thought he found worth having. "That is a reasonable direction," he said. She found herself wanting to say more than she had said, which was unusual enough to notice. She said instead, "What made you buy this particular mountain?" He thought about it. "I came up to look at the mining prospects on the South Ridge," he said. "Everybody in the valley was convinced there was silver in the South Ridge. I walked up one morning in October early, before anybody else was on the trail." He paused. "The light up here in October early morning, it does something to the air that I had never seen anywhere else. The whole valley was still in the dark, and the mountain was in full light, and the air was so clear you could see individual trees on the far ridge 20 miles out." He stopped. He seemed briefly uncertain whether to continue. "I forgot about the silver," he said. "I bought the land because of the light." Elara looked at the man who had bought a mountain because of the quality of its morning light, and who had a cup of dried wildflowers on his shelf, and who had carved a bird out of dark wood with patient, careful detail, and she recalibrated something in her assessment of him slightly and without comment. "That is a reasonable reason," she said. December moved through its short, brilliant days and its long, absolute nights. The snow on the level ground above the cabin was 4 feet deep by the middle of the month and still building. The spruce trees surrounding the hollow had taken on the formal, weighted look of trees under serious accumulation, their boughs bent in curves that were architectural in their precision. The paths that Bram kept clear between the cabin, the woodshed, and the animal shelter were trenches through white walls, neat-sided and purposeful. Elara worked. This is not a simple sentence. It contains within it the complete texture of days that were full from before sunrise to after dark with the physical, unromantic labor of keeping two people alive and functional in a mountain winter. The fire required constant management, the wood boxes refilled 3 and 4 times daily. The food required planning against the mathematical reality of finite stores and a finite timeline every meal, a calculation against the larger account. The animals needed tending when Bram's other work kept him from it. The cabin itself required the ongoing maintenance of any structure fighting a prolonged assault from weather, the draft sealing and the frost chinking, and the clearing of snow from the roof edges before the weight could compromise the structural logic. She did all of it. She did it the way she had always done work, with full attention and no complaint, and the particular economy of movement that comes from having learned that efficiency is a form of endurance, that the person who wastes nothing lasts longest. What she had not anticipated was that doing this work in this place for wages she was paid on the first of every month in coin, counted out on the table, and counted again by her in front of him without embarrassment, would feel different from every other work she had done. The difference was not comfort. The work was not comfortable. The difference was ownership, not of the land or the cabin, not yet, not in any legal sense, but of her own effort. When she swept the floor of this cabin, the floor was clean, and it remained clean because of something she had done, and she was paid for having done it, and the transaction was complete. No further claim was made, no accumulation of obligation, no debt being tallied against her in some unspoken account that would come due in a form she had not agreed to. She understood this as the thing she had been saving toward in her tin box all those years. Not a destination, a condition. The condition of being in possession of her own labor. One morning in the 3rd week of December, she was carrying wood from the shed to the porch, which required 4 trips because the box held more than she could carry in one load, and she had learned not to try to carry more than she could safely manage, because a turned ankle on ice at 2,000 feet in a blizzard was not a recoverable situation. On the 3rd trip, coming back around the corner of the shed, she walked into a wall of snow that Bram had dislodged from the roof of the woodshed with a long-handled rake, and had failed to notice would be directly in her path. She went into it face first and came out the other side, blinking and completely covered from the knees up in dense cold powder. She stood there. Bram was on the shed roof, rake in hand, looking down at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be apologetic and failing, because the conflict between remorse and the objective comedy of what had just occurred was too much for his face to resolve cleanly. She looked up at him. She looked down at herself. She brushed snow from her face with the back of her arm. "I should have warned you," he said. His voice was carefully controlled. "Yes," she said, "you should have." A silence. She turned and went back to the cabin with her armload of wood. She set the wood in the box. She brushed herself off properly. She turned and saw through the window that Bram was still on the shed roof, rake in hand, not doing anything, and she understood from the set of his shoulders that he was laughing quietly by himself in the way of a person who has something to laugh about and no one to share it with. She stood at the window and felt something move through her chest that was warm and entirely unfamiliar and gone as quickly as it came. She went back out for the 4th load of wood and said nothing about any of it. Christmas came and went with no ceremony. Elara had not kept Christmas in years. Her father had marked it in a quiet way, a slightly better meal, a period of intentional stillness in the evening, a recognition that certain days asked to be acknowledged differently than others. After his death, there had been no reason to mark it, and Corbin had never shown interest in anything that did not immediately benefit himself. So the day had become simply another day in the calendar, notable only because the supply stores were closed. She woke on Christmas morning and lay in her small room for a moment and thought about her father, and then stopped thinking about him because it was not a line of thought she could follow all the way to its end and have the day she needed to have. She got up, she built the fire, she looked at what was available in the stores and made a breakfast that was better than ordinary. Not in a declarative way, just materially, better eggs and cured pork and a proper biscuit instead of the usual porridge, and she set it on the table. Bram came down from the loft. He stopped when he saw the table. He looked at it for a moment. "Sit down," she said. "It will get cold." He sat. He looked at the plate in front of him, and then he looked at her with an expression she did not have a ready category for. It was not gratitude exactly. It was more like recognition, the look of someone who has been seen doing something they did not know was visible. He said, "My mother used to make biscuits like this." It was the most personal thing he had said to her in 6 weeks of close proximity. She understood it as the offering it was. "Mine too," she said. She sat down across from him and picked up her fork. She put a small amount of rendered fat in with the butter. "The texture is different." "Yes," he said. He picked up his fork. That is exactly what she did. They ate in the particular silence of people who are sharing something that does not require words to make it real. January arrived, and with it the coldest temperatures of the season, and a settled accepting quality to the days that Elara had not expected. She had expected to feel trapped. She had lived her entire life in conditions not of her choosing, and a mountain cabin under 4 feet of snow with no possibility of departure should have felt like the latest version of those conditions. It did not. She examined this fact periodically and could not find a single explanation for it, only a collection of smaller ones. The wages, the door that was hers and that she could close, the work that ended when it was done rather than expanding to fill whatever space she left. The man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and had never once in 6 weeks looked at her as though she were a problem requiring management. She had been managed her entire life by people who called it something else. Bram did not manage her. He occupied the same space she occupied and did his own work, and came to the table, and went back to the mountain, and returned in the evenings with the cold still on him, and the quiet that was simply his nature, not a message, not a strategy, just who he was. In the evenings, if the wind was not too strong for the sound to carry clearly, she had noticed that he sometimes sat at the table after she had gone to her room, and she could hear through the wall the faint sound of the small carving tools she had found in the bottom of the tool chest. She had not asked about it. She knew without asking that it was a private practice, the work he did for no reason except that he wanted to do it, like her book of pressed flowers at the bottom of the chest. One evening in January, she came back into the main room for a cup of water later than usual, and found him at the table with a piece of pale wood and a small knife, working with the concentrated stillness of someone who is doing the thing they are best at. He did not startle or cover the work when she came in. He simply looked up and then back down. She got her water. She stood for a moment looking at the piece of wood in his hands, which was clearly becoming a bird, though it was still more potential than formed the general suggestion of wings and a body emerging from the block. "What kind?" she asked. He turned it slightly in the lamplight. "Hawk," he said. "A red tail. There is one that hunts the meadow above the tree line. She has been here every summer for the 4 years I have been watching." He paused. "I have been trying to get the wing angle right for 2 winters. Elara looked at the carving on the shelf, the finished hawk she had noticed the first night. She looked at the one in his hands. "The first one is good," she said. "The angle is wrong," he said. "She holds her wings differently when she rides the thermal than when she is in active flight." I did not understand the difference until the second summer I watched her. He was not asking for her opinion. He was simply explaining the problem to someone who had asked. She understood this because it was the way she herself explained things, as a way of thinking out loud rather than as a bid for reassurance. "Show me," she said. He looked up. "What? The difference in the angle. I have not seen a hawk at full thermal ride. Show me what you mean." He looked at her for a moment. Then he set down the carving and held up his own hands, his arms slightly extended, his wrists adjusted to a particular position, thumbs dropping slightly, fingers spread in a way that demonstrated a very specific aerodynamic condition. It was an oddly graceful gesture from a man of his size, precise and careful. She looked at his hands. She looked at the carving. She looked at his hands again. "I see," she said. "The leading edge is level, but the trailing edge lifts. It is a different geometry." He looked at his own hands and then at her with the expression of a man who has been trying to describe a color to someone who has never seen it and has discovered that they already know the color. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." She went back to her room. She lay on the bed and looked at the wooden ceiling and listened to the faint, patient sound of the small knife against the wood. She was thinking about his hands in that position, the precise geometry of a hawk at thermal ride. She recognized this as a type of thinking she had not done in a very long time, and she was careful with it the way you are careful with something that might break if handled incorrectly. February came in hard and then softened toward the end of its short run and began to show in small ways that it was not entirely without mercy. The light stayed longer in the evenings by a noticeable margin. The quality of the cold changed from the absolute cold of January, which was the cold of something permanent, to a cold that had contingency in it, that admitted the theoretical possibility of other conditions. On the clearest days at midday, the snow on the south-facing slope above the cabin showed a faint wet glitter that had not been there in January. Elara noticed these things because she noticed everything, because the habit of close observation was as natural to her as breathing, because paying attention had always been the primary tool available to her for navigating a world that changed its conditions without warning. She noticed other things too. In that February things that she catalogued with the same careful attention and did not speak about. She noticed that when she was carrying something heavy, which was regularly because heavy things needed carrying, and she was fully capable of carrying them. Bram did not move to take the thing from her. He had done this once, early on, reached for the water barrel as she was moving it, and she had given him a look that contained several years of compressed opinion on the subject of men deciding that her strength was a problem requiring their intervention, and he had stepped back and never done it again. What he did instead, without announcement, was to arrange things so that heavy things needed carrying less often. The water barrel was positioned more usefully. The wood boxes were kept fuller, so the loads were more manageable. The grain sacks for the animals were stored at a height that required less lifting. None of this was spoken about. None of it was offered as evidence of his consideration. It was simply done. She noticed that he had begun to leave books on the table, not presented to her, not offered, simply left there, a volume of natural history, a collection of illustrated surveys of western mountain ranges, a book on the habits and territories of raptors. She read them all. They left in her mind the particular satisfaction of learning things that are true and verifiable and indifferent to opinion. She noticed that when she laughed, which was not often, but was becoming less rare, he turned toward the sound, the way a person turns toward a fire involuntarily with the complete attention of someone responding to warmth. She noticed that she was aware of where he was in any given room without looking. She examined all of these observations with the same dispassion she brought to everything and arrived at a conclusion she had not been heading toward when she climbed into a wagon in a blizzard 3 months ago. She allowed herself to arrive at it. She did not yet do anything with it. She was a woman who had learned that the space between understanding something and acting on it was where most of the important decisions actually lived. On the last night of February, the wind came up from the south for the first time since November. It was a different wind entirely from the north wind that had run the winter warmer and less purposeful, carrying in it the distant possibility of mud. The spruce trees moved in a way they had not moved in months, loosened, and from the highest branches a slow, continuous fall of accumulated snow released and drifted down through the lamplight in the window in long, lazy curtains. Bram came in from his evening round of the animals and stood on the threshold, his coat still on. And he looked at the south wind moving the trees, and he said, "First Chinook of the year." Elara was at the table. She looked up. She had not known the word, but understood it immediately from context. Does it last? A few days, then hard cold again for another month most years. But it means the turn is coming. She looked at the window. The snow from the spruce branches drifted past the glass. She was aware that the word turn meant spring, and spring meant the road down the mountain would be passable again, and the road down the mountain being passable meant that she had choices she had not had since November. She was aware that she was not thinking about those choices with the urgency she would have brought to them in November. "A month," she said. "Give or take," he said. He took off his coat and hung it on the peg. He came to the table and sat down. He looked at her in the careful, direct way he had, the way that did not presume anything, but did not pretend not to see things either. "Spring will come," he said, "and whatever you want to do when it does, you will be able to do it." She looked at him across the table. The fire was burning well behind him, and the lamplight was on his face, and the Chinook wind moved the trees outside the window. She said, "And if what I want to do is stay." The quality of the silence that followed was different from any silence they had shared before. Not empty, not waiting. More like the silence at the top of a breath, a moment of full suspension before the next thing begins. Bram looked at her for a long moment. His face did what it sometimes did in lamplight, settled into its truest version of itself, the one without performance or defense. "Then you stay," he said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath the level that was not. "And I would not find that a hardship." She held his eyes for 3 full seconds, and then she looked back down at the book in front of her, the one about raptors and their territories. She did not say anything else, but for the first time in longer than she could calculate, the future she was looking at was not a corridor narrowing toward a wall. It was the mountain in October light, every detail visible the far ridge 20 miles out, and individual trees on it, clear as if you could touch them, and the whole vast white expanse of it, open in every direction. She turned the page. March came in the way it always came to Riven Peak, not with the gentle suggestion of spring that the lower world enjoyed, but with a kind of negotiation, 2 or 3 days of the Chinook warmth, followed by a hard return of cold. Then warmth again, the mountain and the season, working out the terms of their arrangement with no particular regard for what the people living on the mountain might prefer. The snow did not melt so much as it consolidated, losing its loose powder quality and becoming dense and granular, the kind of snow that held a boot print with precision and reflected the midday sun with an intensity that required squinting. Elara moved through those March days with a quality of attention that was different from the watchful wariness of November and December. She was still careful. She did not think she would ever entirely stop being careful, but the calculations she was running had changed their nature. She was no longer calculating exits and contingencies and the geometry of how to protect herself in a situation that might turn. She was calculating something more difficult and in some ways more demanding than survival. She was calculating what it might mean to want something. The thing she wanted was not simple to name. It was not Bram specifically, or not only Bram. It was the life that had assembled itself around her on this mountain over the course of a winter. The particular texture of days that were hard and purposeful and entirely her own, the mornings before the light, when the stove came up under her hands and the cabin held its warmth against the dark outside the evenings by the fire, with the books he left on the table, and the sound of the small knife against wood through the wall, the way the mountain looked at certain angles of light, the red-tailed hawk that had returned to the meadow above the tree line in the first week of March, earlier than Bram had expected her riding the thermals with the precise geometry of a creature that knew exactly what it was built for. She wanted this. The wanting was clear and unambiguous, and she looked at it directly without flinching, because she had learned in this winter to look at true things directly, which was a different practice than she had been capable of in November. What she did not do was speak it out loud, not fully, not yet. She and Bram had arrived at a territory between them that had no name either of them had applied to it, a territory of small daily intimacies of hands, occasionally passing near each other over the table of laughter that came more easily now of a mutual knowledge built from 4 months of close proximity that was as detailed and specific as any knowledge she had ever had of another person. One evening in the second week of March he had shown her the carving of the hawk in its new version, and the wing angle was exactly right, and she had held it in her hands and felt the weeks of patient work in it, and looked up at him, and whatever was in her face at that moment had made him look away first, which she understood as its own kind of answer. But they had not crossed any line. They stood at the edge of a territory that both of them could see clearly, and neither of them had yet walked into, and there was a kind of richness in standing at that edge, in the full awareness of what was possible, that Elara was not in a hurry to give up. She had never in her life stood at the edge of something possible without being pushed, or pulled, or simply falling. She was not going to rush past the experience of choosing. April arrived, and with it the serious beginning of the melt. The south-facing slope above the cabin went first, the snow retreating upward in a daily visible line, leaving behind it the dark wet earth of the high meadow, and the first tentative color, the pale yellows and whites of the earliest alpine flowers that did not wait for full warmth but came up through the last of the snow at the edges, because they were built for exactly this, for the difficult margins for the cold and the light together. Elara found them on a morning when she had gone up the slope above the cabin to check on the condition of the trail that Bram used to reach the upper meadow where he maintained a small trap line. She had not expected the flowers. She stopped when she saw them, a scatter of pale blooms at the snow line, and stood there for a long moment with the cold of the remaining snow on one side of her and the smell of released earth on the other. She did not pick any of them. She came back down to the cabin with the specific, bright feeling of someone who has been given something they did not ask for and discovered they needed it badly. Bram was on the porch splitting wood when she came around the corner of the cabin. He looked at her face, and something in his expression shifted a small, careful brightening. "What did you find?" he said. It was not a question exactly, more an invitation. "The first flowers," she said, "above the snow line." He set down the maul. He looked at the slope above the cabin with the expression of a man checking something he had been waiting to confirm. "Earlier than last year," he said. "That is a good sign." She stood on the bottom step of the porch and looked up at him, and for a moment there was something between them that was simply the shared pleasure of being in a place they both loved at a moment that was worth noticing. Then she went inside to start the midday meal, and he went back to the wood, and the moment settled into the fabric of the day like all the other moments of that winter, quiet and permanent, and entirely without witness except themselves. The road down the mountain became passable in the second week of April, slowly at first and then decisively, the frozen ruts thawing and draining and firming again overnight, until the surface was reliable enough for the wagon. Bram made the first trip down to the gulch on a Tuesday, the first supply run of the year, carrying the season's accounting and the list of what needed replenishing. He asked her before he left if she needed anything brought back from town. She gave him a list that was practical and specific and did not include anything personal. She stood on the porch and watched the wagon go down the switchback road and disappear into the trees, and felt the mountain close quietly around the cabin in the way it did when he was absent, not ominous, just different, a subtle change in the texture of the air. She did the day's work, and he came back in the late afternoon, and the mountain opened again, and she did not examine the fact that she had felt his return before she heard the wagon on the road. She was still being careful with certain facts. He came back with the supplies and the mail, which was 3 months accumulated, and largely irrelevant to their daily lives, and a newspaper from the nearest proper city, 6 weeks old, which she read cover to cover that evening while he sat at the table with the hawk carving, making small adjustments to the primary feathers that he had decided were not entirely right. May opened the mountain further. The wildflowers moved up the slope in sequence, each species following its own specific protocol of temperature and light, and Elara began taking her book of pressed flowers out on the mornings when her work allowed an hour on the upper slopes. She had not opened the book since leaving the valley. Cabin had kept it at the bottom of the chest under everything else, as though it were a thing she was not sure she was still the person who kept it. Now she opened it and found that she was still exactly the person who kept it, and that the mountain was going to fill its remaining pages in a season if she was not deliberate about selection. She was deliberate. She was always deliberate. One evening she left the book open on the table. Not intentionally, she had been called away from it by something on the stove and had not gone back, and when she returned, Bram was sitting at the table with his coffee, and the book was in front of him. He was not reading it. He was looking at a page near the middle, a mounted specimen of a deep purple mountain aster, with her handwriting below it, the date and the location, and a brief note about the light conditions when she had found it. He looked up when she came to the table. He did not close the book. She sat down across from him. He looked at the page again. He said, "You have been doing this for 3 years." "3 summers," she said. "Yes." He turned a page. He did not look through it the way a person looks through something that is not theirs. He looked at it the way he looked at the hawk on the thermal, with genuine close attention. "This is a serious collection," he said. She had never heard anyone use the word serious about anything she had made for herself. The word landed somewhere and stayed there. "It keeps me accurate," she said, "about what I am looking at." He looked at her. "May I read the notes?" She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. He turned back to the beginning of the book and read through it slowly, and she sat across from him and drank her coffee and let him look at the private record of 3 summers of her own attention, all the small, precise observations that she had never made for anyone but herself. And it felt not like exposure, but like being known, which were entirely different things. He read for 40 minutes without speaking. When he closed the book, he set it on the table between them and looked at her. "The one from October 10th, he said. "The late bloom at the tree line, no color left in it, only the shape." "Yes," she said. "I know that exact place," he said. "There is a small southwest-facing hollow just where the trees thin out. It holds warmth longer than anywhere else at that elevation. Things grow there past when they should." She looked at him. "That is exactly the place." He looked at the closed book. "I have walked past that hollow for 11 years, he said quietly, "and I never thought to write it down." She picked up her coffee. She looked at the man across the table who had walked past a small warm hollow for 11 years and had now, through no direct action of either of them, been given the written record of a flower that had bloomed there one October morning in the first light. She thought she understood then more completely than she had before the nature of what had been building between them since November. It was not rescue and gratitude, which was what Corbin would have assumed, and what Silas Greer would have calculated, and what the men in the Miners' Rest would have reduced it to if anyone had asked them. It was not proximity and convenience, which was the cynical version. It was this. 2 people who paid attention to the same kinds of things, who found the same things worth recording and preserving, who had each been doing it alone and in private for years, discovering that the other one also knew where the late blooming flowers were. She did not say any of this. She did not need to. She was beginning to understand that with this particular man, the things that were true did not require saying. They could simply be true together in the same room at the same table, in the same life, on the same mountain. The trouble came on a Thursday in the middle of May, in the way that trouble usually comes without announcement, and from a direction she had stopped watching because it had seemed sufficiently behind her. She was alone. Bram had gone up to the high meadow before sunrise to check the last of the winter trap line and close it out for the season, a full day's work at that elevation, and she had expected him back by late afternoon. She was in the kitchen garden that she had begun laying out on the south side of the cabin, turning the dark, high-altitude soil with a spade, planting the rows with the same mathematical precision she brought to the food stores, calculating yield against the short growing season. She heard hoofbeats on the lower trail. She turned because hoofbeats on the lower trail meant someone coming up the road, and visitors to Riven Peak were essentially unknown. It could be Bram returning early, but Bram had taken the horse and the wagon, and the sound she heard was 2 horses at a pace that was not the measured pace of a man coming home. She was still holding the spade when they came around the last curve of the road and into the open ground in front of the cabin. Corbin and Silas Greer. She recognized them simultaneously, and the recognition went through her like cold water, not fear exactly, not the specific physical fear of the saloon in November, something older and more complex than fear, the recognition of a pattern recurring, the particular sensation of a thing you thought was behind you stepping back into the frame of your present life. Corbin looked worse than November. The months between then and now had not been a season of improvement. He was thinner, his face sharper, the quality of his clothing suggesting he had not recovered from the transaction in the saloon in any financial sense, which did not surprise her. Corbin's problem had never been the specific debt. His problem was the way he moved through the world, always a little ahead of consequence, always able to produce a reason why what had happened was someone else's doing. He would be in the same place again within a season. Silas Greer looked exactly the same as he had in November. That was, she reflected, the most accurate thing about him. He was the kind of man who did not change because he had never been required to, whose clean hands remained clean because other people got theirs dirty on his behalf. They stopped their horses at the edge of the cleared ground. Silas took in the cabin and the garden plot, and her standing there with a spade in her hands with the dispassionate inventory look she remembered from the back room of the Miner's Rest. "Miss Voss," he said. She did not return the greeting. She stood where she was, the spade handle loose in her right hand, her weight balanced in the way of someone who has not decided what they are about to do but is fully prepared to do it. "You are a hard woman to locate," Silas said. His voice had the same quiet river quality it always had, unhurried and without warmth. The winter closed the road for longer than expected. "What do you want?" she said. Corbin shifted in his saddle. He had not met her eyes yet, which was consistent. "My brother has no business here," she said. "Your brother has a great deal of business here," Silas said. "We have a business proposition, as a matter of fact. We have obtained a timber contract on the lower slopes of the South Ridge, a significant operation. We need experienced hands for the camp management." He paused. "And we remember that you are a woman of considerable practical skill." She looked at him steadily. "You are describing unpaid labor with different words," she said. Silas smiled the smile that did not reach anything behind it. "I am describing a family arrangement," he said. "Your brother is part of this venture. It seems natural that family would support one another." Corbin found his voice then finally. He looked at her, and she could see on his face the same combination she had seen in November, the relief of a man who has found a solution to his problem, the specific relief that came from the fact that the solution was her. "Elara, it would only be for the season," he said. "The camp needs someone who can manage the provisions and the cooking for a crew of 15. You are the only person I know who could handle that. The only person you could use without paying," she said. His jaw tightened. There it was, the indignation right on schedule. "After everything I have done for you." She looked at her brother for a long moment. She thought about what it would cost her to respond to that specific sentence with the full accounting she was capable of making. She decided it would cost her more than it was worth, and she saved it. Silas moved his horse one step forward. It was a small movement and deliberate, the kind of movement designed to remind a person on foot of the geometry of the situation. "Let us be direct," he said. "You are living here as a hired woman. The man who owns this land is not your family and does not share your interests. When his need for your particular services concludes, you will have no position here and no legal standing. You would be better served to come back to your own people and take part in a venture that will actually benefit you in the long run." She recognized the argument for what it was. It was designed precisely for her. It reached for the specific shape of her uncertainty and tried to press on it. You are not really here. You are not really wanted here. You are a convenience, and conveniences are discarded when something more convenient presents itself. She felt it land. She would not have been human if she had not felt it land. She thought about the chair he had reinforced without telling her, the books left on the table, the hawk carved with the right wing angle. After 2 winters of trying. The way he had said, I would not find that a hardship with the thing underneath the level that was not level at all. She thought about these things, and she felt the doubt pressing, and she felt something underneath the doubt that was new. That was the thing she had been building toward all winter, without fully knowing it, and she held on to that thing. "Get off this land," she said. Silas's expression did not change. "I do not think you have the authority to issue that instruction." "You came here for my compliance," she said. "You do not have it. Everything else you came here for you will not find. Get off this land." Corbin leaned forward. "Elara, you're making a mistake. You have nothing here. You are a hired woman on another man's mountain, and when he is done with the winter and done with you, you will have nothing. At least with us, you would have family." She looked at her brother. She remembered standing in the back room of the Miner's Rest and looking at his face, and seeing the relief on it when the transaction was nearly complete, when the weight of her care for him was about to be transferred to someone else's account. She remembered understanding in 3 seconds of looking at him that there was nothing left to save between them. She had understood it then, and she understood it now, and she said it for the first time out loud. "You are not my family," she said. Her voice was even and entirely certain, the way the voice is when it is saying something that has been true for a long time and is only now being spoken. "You have not been my family since you put me on a table in the Miner's Rest to clear a debt you made by choosing to be exactly what you are. I do not owe you anything. I have not owed you anything since that night, and I owed you a great deal less than I paid for the 9 years before it." Corbin's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, none of them pretty. Silas studied her for a moment with the cool attention of a man recalculating. Then he looked at the cabin, at the garden plot, at the cleared paths, and the solid structure and the general evidence of a well-maintained and prosperous homestead. He looked back at her. "You have no legal standing here," he said quietly and precisely. "You are an employee. When that changes, which it may or may not, you will still be a woman in a territory where a woman's legal standing in property matters is limited at best. I would think carefully about the security of the position you believe you hold." He pulled his horse around without waiting for a response. Corbin followed him, and Elara noticed that her brother did not look back, which told her everything about the depth of whatever regret he was capable of. She stood in the garden until the sound of the horses on the lower trail faded entirely. Then she was aware of the spade in her hand, the solid wood of the handle against her palm, the dark overturned earth of the garden, rose around her, the cabin behind her, solid and warm in the afternoon sun. She was aware of the mountain in every direction, the snowfields on the upper peaks. The green line of the tree line moving upward as the season advanced, the hawk somewhere above the upper meadow, riding a thermal she could not see. She was aware of what Silas Greer had said. Legal standing, employee. A woman in a territory where property rights were limited at best. She walked to the cabin. She went inside. She sat at the table, and she was very still for a long time. The words they had spoken were doing what words designed to cause damage do when they find their target circulating in her thoughts with a persistence that had nothing to do with whether she believed them, and everything to do with the fact that they had named her oldest and deepest fear. Not that she was unloved, not even that she was unwanted. Her deepest fear was more specific than that. It was this, that every place she had ever been was a place someone else owned, and her presence in it was always conditional on someone else's decision, and no matter how much she worked and how well she did it, the condition could always be revoked. She had been building toward something all winter, and those words had reached into the construction and shaken it. She sat with the shaking, and she let it move through her, and she tried to find on the other side of it the thing she had held on to in the garden when the doubt pressed. She found it. It was smaller than she would have liked, less certain than she wanted, but it was there. She got up. She put water on for coffee. She went to her room and got the tin box from the bottom of the chest. She sat back down at the table and opened the tin box and looked at the coins inside, the careful accumulation of the winter's wages paid on the first of every month in coin, counted out on the table. She was counting it when she heard the wagon on the upper trail. She heard Bram bring the horse in and tend to her in the shelter. She heard his boots on the porch. The door opened. He came into the room, and he read her face the way he read everything she did not say, which was with the quiet accuracy of a man who had been paying close attention for a long time. He sat down across from her without removing his coat. He looked at the tin box on the table. He looked at her face. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it in the plain and sequential way she told true things without drama and without minimizing. She told him about Corbin and Silas on their horses, and the timber camp, and the family arrangement, and what Silas had said about her legal standing and the condition of her position. Bram listened with his arms on the table and his eyes on her face, and did not speak until she was done. Then he sat for a moment in the particular silence she had come to know as the silence he kept when he was deciding what was actually true, separating it from what he felt and what he wanted, which was a practice she recognized because she did it herself. He said, "Do you believe them?" She looked at him. "Which part?" "Any of it." She held his eyes. The honest answer was complicated, and she gave it the respect of not simplifying it. "I believe that Silas Greer understands how to find the places that are not certain and press on them," she said. "I believe he found one." Bram was quiet for another moment. He looked at the tin box on the table. He looked at her. He stood up from the table and crossed to the lockbox that sat on the shelf beside the window, the one she had never asked about, and he had never offered to explain, and he opened it with the key he kept on the cord around his neck. He took something out. He came back to the table and sat down and placed it in front of her. It was a folded document. Heavy paper creased at the center, official in its weight and dimension. She looked at it on the table between them. "Open it," he said. She unfolded the document. It took her a moment to understand what she was reading, not because the language was obscure, but because what it said was so far outside the territory of what she had expected that her mind required a second pass to accept it as real. It was a land deed. She knew what land deeds looked like. She had seen her father's, the one that had covered the rented cabin in the valley, which had never actually been his, and had only ever documented how much he owed for the use of it. This was different. This was an instrument of ownership properly drawn with the territorial seal at the top and 2 signatures at the bottom, and a legal description of the property in the dense, precise language that courts recognize as binding. The property was described as the north half of the Riven Peak homestead claim, registered in the territory comprising the cabin and its structures, the garden ground, the animal shelter, and the cleared land extending to the natural boundary of the upper tree line on the north and east faces. The name on the deed as owner was Elara Voss. She read it twice. She read the legal description again. She looked at the signature at the bottom, which was Bram's, witnessed, and notarized the ink. Not new. Not signed tonight, in a gesture of the moment, but signed weeks ago. The paper handled enough times to have taken on the particular softness of a document that has been folded and unfolded and considered and refolded. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the careful stillness of a man who has done something he believes is right and is waiting to find out if he has understood the situation correctly. "This is dated March," she said. "The first week of March," he said, "when I made the early supply run after the first Chinook. The land office in town notarized it." She looked back at the document. The first week of March was before the evening she had told him she might want to stay. It was before the book of pressed flowers on the table. It was before most of the things she had thought of as the turning points of the season. He had done this before any of those things, which meant he had done it not as a response to something between them, but as a prior and independent decision made on his own understanding of what was right. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was deciding how to say something true without reducing it by simplifying it. "When I bought you out of that debt in November," he said, "I did it because what was happening in that room was wrong, and I was in a position to stop it. That part was simple." He paused. "What was not simple was everything after. Because you came here, and you worked this mountain all winter, and you did it with everything you had every single day, and this place became better for what you brought to it. Not just the work. You brought your attention to this mountain. You know where the late flowers are. You know how the bread rises at altitude. You reinforced the window shutter and reorganized the stores, and you fixed the things I had left unfixed for years because I was used to them being broken." He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. A person who does all of that for a place deserves to own part of it. That seemed like a simple fact to me in March, and it still does. She looked at the deed in her hands. She was aware of something large moving through her that she was not going to be able to contain entirely, and she was not sure she wanted to try. It was not the deed itself, though the deed was real, and its implications were real. And she understood exactly what legal ownership of land meant for a woman in her position in a territory like this. It was the date on the deed. The first week of March. Before she had said she wanted to stay. Before the evening at the table with the book of pressed flowers. Before any declaration or demonstration that could have prompted it. He had simply decided that it was right. She had spent her entire adult life in a world that decided things about her, that arranged her circumstances according to its own convenience, and called it necessity. She had never been on the receiving end of a decision made purely on her behalf by someone who had nothing to gain from making it. She did not have a ready response for that. She was not sure one existed. "Bram," she said. Her voice was different than she intended, lower and less steady, and she let it be what it was. He looked at her. "This is the most significant thing anyone has ever done for me," she said. "I need you to know that I understand what it is." He held her eyes. "I know you do," he said. "That is why I gave it to you." She folded the deed carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands and looked at the table and let the enormity of it settle into her without trying to manage it. The fire in the stove was burning evenly. The lamp on the table put its steady light across the familiar surfaces of the room that was half hers, all of it hers in every way that mattered except the legal way, and now that way too. She thought about Silas Greer and his clean hands and his quiet voice saying, "You have no legal standing here." She thought about the care he had taken to find the exact place that was not certain and press on it. She thought about how well he had known where to press. She thought about the deed in her hands. "They will come back," she said. Bram nodded once. "Probably." "Silas does not give up when there is a use to be had," she said. "The timber contract on the South Ridge is real. He needs someone to manage the camp. He does not want to pay for it if he can avoid paying." She looked up. "He will come back with Corbin, and he will come back with an argument he thinks will work better than the last one." "Let him come," Bram said. There was no heat in it. It was a simple statement of position. "I want to be the one to handle it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. There was no argument in it, no qualification, no gentle suggestion that he might stand in front of her when things became difficult. Just the clean acknowledgement of her right to manage her own affairs on her own land. She noticed this as she had noticed all the other small things, and she put it in the same place she kept the others. She went to bed that night with the deed on the wooden chest beside her book of pressed flowers, and she lay in the dark listening to the mountain and thinking about the morning. She thought about it practically and specifically, the way she thought about everything that needed doing, identifying the resources available and the terrain and the most direct route from where things were to where they needed to be. She thought about Silas Greer and what he understood and what he did not understand. She thought about her own hands and what they were capable of. She slept. She was up before light as always. The stove came up under her hands as always. She made coffee and she got the deed from the chest and she read it one more time in the early morning. Quiet, not because she had forgotten what it said, but because she wanted the language of it to be absolutely current in her mind, every legal term and boundary description exactly located, every implication clear. Then she went to the woodshed. Bram kept the Winchester rifle on the rack above the door in the woodshed, which was a practical location close to the cabin, but not in it accessible quickly, and not in the way of daily household activity. She had known it was there since the first week of November. She had not touched it. She went to it now and took it down and checked it with the unhurried competence of a woman who had grown up in rough country and understood that firearms were tools, that tools required knowing, and that knowing them was simply practical. It was clean and in good order. She returned it to the rack satisfied. She went back inside and started breakfast. Bram came down from the loft a half-hour later and found the table set and the coffee poured and Elara sitting in her chair reading the territorial land law section of the almanac that lived on the second shelf. He looked at her and at the almanac and at the particular quality of her attention, which was the quality of attention she brought to things that were going to require precision. He sat down. He poured his coffee. He did not ask any questions. They came the following morning. Elara heard the horses on the lower trail, and she was on the porch before they cleared the trees, standing at the top of the 2 steps with the deed in her left hand and her right hand empty at her side. Bram was visible at the corner of the cabin, splitting wood with the steady rhythm of a man doing a morning task, not positioned between her and the riders, but present in the way of someone who is available if needed and otherwise has work to do. Corbin and Silas came into the cleared ground and stopped their horses in the same place they had stopped them 2 days before. Silas looked at her on the porch and at the document in her hand, and she watched him register both and recalculate. There was a third man with them this time, one of Greer's men, the kind who rode behind and said nothing, and were present as a kind of arithmetic, an additional weight on one side of the scale. He stayed at the edge of the trees. Silas looked at the deed. He could not read it from where he sat, but he knew what it was. She could see him knowing it in the precise adjustment of his expression. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Greer," she said. "This is private land. You are on it without invitation. I will ask you once to state your business or turn your horses around." Corbin leaned forward on his saddle. He was using his earnest expression, the one she had seen him deploy her entire life when he needed something, and had decided that sincerity was the most efficient approach. "Elara, we came to talk. That is all. Whatever happened the other day, I think we got off on the wrong foot." "There is no wrong foot to get off on," she said. "There is nothing to negotiate. There is no arrangement to be made. This is my land and my home, and neither of you has any business here." Silas shifted his attention from the deed to her face, recalibrating again with the patience of a man who had been solving problems involving resistant people for a long time. "A deed can be a complicated instrument," he said, "especially one signed hastily under conditions that might be questioned. A woman living on a man's land in conditions that could be characterized various ways, receiving property that could be construed as payment for various kinds of services." He let that sit in the air. She had expected this. She had thought about it the night before, identifying the arguments he had available, and which one he would use when the deed neutralized the others. She had found it, and she had prepared for it, and she still felt the ugliness of it land, because some things land, regardless of preparation, and she let it land, and she held her footing. "The deed is dated March," she said, "the first week of March. It was notarized by the land office in Blackwood Gulch, witnessed by 2 parties, and filed with the Territorial Registry on March the 9th. She looked at him steadily. "I arrived on this mountain in November. The deed was filed in March. Whatever characterization you attempt to put on my presence here, Mr. Greer, you will need to explain to a territorial judge why a man acting on the motive you are implying would complete and file a deed 4 months before making any other kind of declaration. I have read the territorial property statutes this morning. I am confident in how that argument will end." Silas was quiet. He was looking at her with a new expression, one she had not seen on him before, the expression of a man who has encountered a variable he did not account for. She continued, "I am also aware that the timber contract you hold on the South Ridge requires right-of-way access through the Lower Creek Trail, which crosses the boundary of this property at the eastern edge of the Spruce Grove. The legal description on my deed covers that boundary. If you intend to run a logging operation on the South Ridge, you will need to negotiate that right-of-way with the property owners. That is myself and Mr. Calloway." The silence from the direction of the woodshed had a quality to it that she recognized as Bram holding himself very still. Silas looked at her for a long moment. He was thinking. She could see him thinking. She had learned watching men like Silas Greer that the thinking they did in moments like this was not about right and wrong. It was about cost and benefit, about whether the resistance in front of them was worth the price of overcoming it, or whether the same resources applied elsewhere would return a better result. She did not help him think. She stood on the top step of her porch on her land with the deed in her left hand, and she let him calculate. Corbin said her name. She looked at her brother, who was sitting on his horse at the edge of her land, with the earnest expression fading into something more honest and less comfortable. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the saloon in November directly, and with full knowledge of what she was seeing, and this time she did not feel the tearing sensation of a severed obligation. The obligation had been severed in November. What she felt now was simpler and cleaner than that. She felt the absence of debt, the specific freedom of a person who has paid everything they owed and closed the account. "Corbin," she said, "I will say this once and I will mean it completely. I wish you no harm. I am not your enemy, and I am not interested in being your enemy. But I am also not your resource, and I am not your solution, and I am not your family, in any sense that costs me anything. If you manage to become a person who can stand behind his own choices, I hope your life goes well. But this land and this mountain and the life I am making here are not available to you in any capacity. Do you understand me?" He looked at her. He looked like a man standing in a field where he expected to find something and has found only flat, empty ground. He looked like someone the solid thing beneath him had just shifted. "Yeah," he said. His voice was smaller than she had ever heard it. Silas Greer pulled his horse around. He did it with the controlled movements of a man preserving his dignity, which was the only currency he had left in this particular transaction. He did not make any final declaration. Men like Silas understood that final declarations in lost positions were expensive and bought nothing. He simply turned and rode toward the tree line, and Corbin followed him, and the man who had stayed at the edge of the trees turned without having spoken a single word, and they went down the switchback road, and the sound of the 3 horses diminished and was gone. The silence that followed was the silence of a mountain in May, full of birdsong and snowmelt and wind in the high spruce, a living silence. Not the silence of something ended, but the silence of something that has been cleared of what did not belong in it. Elara stood on the porch for a long moment. She looked at the road where they had gone. She looked at the land around her, the garden plot she had started turning the cleared paths to the woodshed, and the animal shelter, the solid face of the cabin behind her. She looked at the upper slope, where the wildflowers were advancing upward by measurable increments each morning. She heard Bram set down the maul. She heard his boots cross the ground to the porch steps. She did not turn around. She was looking at the mountain, at the full expanse of it in the May morning light, the way the snow on the upper peaks had the blue-white quality of something that has been there long enough to become part of the landscape, rather than weather on top of it, and the way the green of the lower slopes moved up toward that white in a line that changed daily. He came to stand beside her, not behind her, not in front of her, beside her, in the way they stood at the table when they were both looking at the same map or the same problem as people who are in the same place looking at the same thing. They stood there for a moment in the May morning on her porch on her mountain. Then she turned to look at him, and he was looking at her, and the expression on his face was not the careful, measured expression she had learned over the winter, the one that held itself back from presuming. It was something else, something that had come forward into the open, now that there was nothing left in the way of it, the way the mountain flowers came forward in spring, not tentative, but absolutely committed, as though they had been waiting through a long winter for exactly this permission. She looked at this man who had walked into a saloon he had not intended to visit, and torn a debt note in half and asked nothing in return except that she choose for herself. Who had built her a chair she could trust, and left books on the table, and carved a hawk through 2 winters until the wing angle was right? Who had filed a deed with her name on it in March because he thought it was right before he knew what she would answer if he asked her anything? She thought about what she wanted. She thought about the practice of wanting which she had been learning all winter, the practice of looking at a true thing directly and letting it be true. The thing she wanted was standing beside her on the porch, looking at her with that unguarded expression, waiting with the patience of a man who had lived alone on a mountain for 11 years and had learned that the things worth having were worth whatever waiting they required. She said, "Bram." "Yes," he said, not a question. She looked at the mountain. She looked at him. She felt the deed in her left hand, the solid, heavy paper of it, and she felt the morning light on her face, and the high, clean air of the mountain in her lungs, and the particular quality of a moment that is made of everything that preceded it, every hard thing and every good thing, and every choice that pointed toward exactly this place. "Would you be willing," she said, "to share your half of this mountain with me for the rest of our lives?" He looked at her for 3 full seconds. The morning light was on his face, and she could see in it everything he had been holding back since March, since November. since whatever moment he had first decided that she was a person worth knowing. All of it unheld now, present and certain, and not performing anything at all. "Yes," he said, "I would be willing." She took one step toward him, and he closed the remaining distance between them, and when he put his arms around her, it was the embrace of two people who have found each other after a long time of looking for something they could not have named until they found it. Not the frantic, desperate embrace of a rescue, nothing conditional about it, nothing owed, nothing borrowed. The embrace of equals, of partners, of two people who have decided freely and with full knowledge of what they are deciding to make one life out of two. She stood in the circle of his arms on the porch of her cabin on her mountain, and she felt the full weight of the winter she had survived, and the full brightness of the spring she was entering, and the specific solidity of a person who knows exactly where they are and exactly how they got there, and does not wish for any of it to have gone differently. After a long moment she stepped back, not away, just back enough to see his face. She was smiling. She knew she was smiling in a way she could not have managed in November, openly without calculation, with the full force of something that had been waiting a long time for a face worth turning toward. He was smiling too, the smile she had seen arriving in pieces all winter, in the slight shift of his mouth when she said something that surprised him, in the brief brightness at the corner of his eye when she laughed, now all the way arrived, complete unheld. It changed his whole face. It made him look like the man he actually was, the man who bought a mountain because of the quality of the October light, and carved a hawk for 2 winters until the angle was exactly right. She looked at him, and she thought that she would like to see this face for a long time. She thought that the mountain would be a very fine place to be for a long time. She thought that she had pressed flowers for 3 summers and had started this 4th summer, and that the remaining pages of the book would not be enough if she stayed here, and that she would need another book and then another, and that this was not a problem, but the best possible kind of abundance. She looked up the slope toward the upper meadow where the hawk was riding the thermals in the May morning. The hawk that had come back 4 days earlier than expected, that had been on this mountain longer than either of them, that knew its own territory absolutely. She watched the hawk make one long sweeping arc across the blue sky above the tree line, rising and rising on the thermal with the perfect geometry of a creature that has found exactly the right current and settled into it completely. She thought about that geometry. The leading edge level, the trailing edge lifted the whole body, committed to the invisible rising air. Not fighting the wind, but reading it. Finding the current that was already there and becoming part of it, and letting it carry everything upward. She had spent her life fighting the wind. She was done with that now. She turned back to Bram, and he was watching her, and she nodded toward the upper slope and said, "She came back early this year." He looked up at the hawk. "She knows this mountain," he said. "She knows where the good air is." "Yes," Elara said. She went inside to start the work of the day. The stove needed tending, the breakfast things, clearing the garden, waiting on the south slope for the next row to be turned. The work was the same work it had been all winter, and she was the same person who had done it with the same capable hands and the same precise attention and the same economical, purposeful movement through the world. But the world had different dimensions now. It had the dimension of ownership, not borrowed space, not conditional presence, but the absolute dimension of a place that was hers, in every sense that the law and the truth together could make a thing yours. It had the dimension of a future she was moving toward, instead of a past she was managing, and it had the dimension of a person who had on the porch of her own cabin on a May morning said yes to being known, and had been met in that yes by someone who had been waiting to say yes since March. Bram came in behind her and picked up his coat from the peg and checked the list on the table of what the upper trapline needed before it was fully put away for the season. He looked at her once across the room with the expression she was going to spend a long time learning all the variations of, and she looked back at him with the expression she felt on her own face, which was new and unguarded, and entirely her own. "I will be back by midday," he said. "I will have something on the table," she said. He went out. She heard his boots on the porch steps and the familiar sound of his movement across the cleared ground toward the upper trail, the particular rhythm of a man who knows exactly where he is going and is not in a hurry, because the mountain is not going anywhere, and neither is he. She stood at the window for a moment and watched him go, his broad back moving through the May morning light up toward the tree line, unhurried and certain. Then she turned to the work that was hers to do. Outside, the mountain held its long and patient silence, the silence of granite and spruce and snowmelt and the small brave flowers advancing daily up the slope, the silence of a red-tailed hawk riding the thermals above the meadow, the silence of a life that had finally arrived at the shape it was always meant to have. The sun moved across the valley below and struck the upper peaks, and the snow there threw light back in every direction, and on the south-facing slope of Riven Peak, the wildflowers opened toward that light the way they always did, without asking permission, without requiring favorable conditions, simply because the light was there, and they were built for exactly this, to find the warmth in difficult places and grow toward it with everything they had.